everyone. I'm Chrissy Zappella, the Blanton Fellow of European Painting and Sculpture at the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to our series, Curated Conversations. Tonight's topic is What Makes a Mother? Variations on the Maternal in Art. And I am joined today, I don't know what time it is. Who knows what time it is. I'm joined this evening right now by two of the Blanton's curators who are going to introduce themselves.
Hi, I am Holly Borham. I am assistant curator of prints and drawings, and we all agreed we would talk about our qualifications tonight. So I would say my primary qualification for being here is that I'm a mother of 3 teenagers.
That's, I think, enough. I am Rosario Granados. I'm the Marilyn Toma Associate Curator, Art of the Spanish Americas. And my qualification, similarly to Holly's, is that I am a mother of 2 amazing kiddos. One is 11 and the other one is 7. So as you can imagine, it's a lot of work, but I adore them, and they're, kind of an inspiration to be here reflecting on what being a mother is and what are the challenges and the joys of having them around. Not right now, because otherwise I would not be here with you, but I'm happy to be here talking about what motherhood is. Or trying to.
I have no qualifications other than I have a wonderful dog whom I love very much, and I also love my own mother very, very much. So I hope that makes me qualified enough. Before we start, a few notes. We would love your participation. We're so excited to interact with other people. So please go ahead and do that. The way you're going to do that for us is by looking down at the bottom of your screen. You're going to see there's some words, chat, Q&A. If you want to ask us a question, you're going to go ahead and write that question in the Q&A so that we can get to it. And if you want to talk to us, which we hope you do, share that in the chat so we can see that. So why don't you right now, let's test out the chat by going ahead and saying hi to us and telling us where you're coming from. I'm right here in Austin, and I believe Holly and Rosario are also. Oh, Carter's in Austin. More Austin people. Fantastic. Any moms? So if you are a mom, the way I want you to tell me you're a mom is by raising your hand, and you're going to raise your hand by hitting Option Y or Alt Y on your keyboard if you are a mom. Oh, lots of moms. Oh my goodness, what'd you do with the kids? They're just running around. Oh, I see some of my mommies.
But there's one thing that we all share, and that's we all have a mom, right? So we are happy also for that reason. My mom is not here with us anymore, but she was an amazing, amazing mother, and I'm so happy to think about her almost every day, I have to say. She passed away, I think, like 4 years already, but it's another way of thinking about motherhood, right?
I think so. My mom is with us in live, but not on Zoom because she doesn't know how it works. So. Maybe one day. That's a great way to start. Thank you, Rosario. So tonight we're talking about what makes a mother, and we realize sometimes what makes a mother is giving birth and raising your child, but that's not the only maternal experience. And lots of us are mothers to people whom we have not given birth to, and lots of us have had mothers who have not given birth to us. So today we want to celebrate all those people and think about that, who've brought so much love to our lives and allow us to give love back to them. And that's a great gift. So let's get started, and we're going to start with Holly.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and start with this beautiful painting here. There we are. Okay, so we're going to start with this beautiful painting from our collection by the French artist Jacques Blanchard. And on the slide that you see right now, I purposely left out the title of the work because I want us to look at it carefully together before deciding what the subject actually is. So at first glance, this painting seems to be a lovely scene with a tranquil mother seated comfortably outdoors, surrounded by her sweet and affectionate children. We might admire the ease with which this mother manages these little ones who clamber all over her. She offers attention to the one at her neck and sustenance to the one at her breast, and a supportive hand to the one at her knee. But then we notice that there are two more children at the right side of the painting. And then we might start to think, well, wait, all these kids seem to be the same age. And are they all siblings? This painting's from 1634. So we might wonder, well, how common were quintuplets back then? And were there fertility treatments in the 17th century? So as these questions pile up, we come to realize that this is probably not a portrait, but we're actually looking at an allegory. And the figure that we're looking at is a personification of the virtue of love. Well, how do I know that? Well, in the Renaissance, there were books that artists could look at that would tell them how to represent certain themes. So if we take a look at the next slide, we will see a page from the most famous of these books, which is Cesare Ripa's Iconologia. And here I'm showing you that he represents love as a tender mother with 3 children. She has a child at her breast to show that she's a nursing mother, someone who self-sacrificially and literally gives of her own body to sustain others. At the top of the page, you'll see the title of the book, Iconologia, and then the word carita, where we get the word charity. Now, when we hear that word, we might think of our favorite local charity, or making a charitable donation, or being on the receiving end of a charity. The Latin root word of caritas can be translated as charity, but also as love. So within the Catholic tradition that these artists are working within, the concept of charity or love fits into the larger theme of the 7 virtues. Now, we might be more familiar or interested in perhaps the 7 deadly sins, but their counterparts are 7 virtues. And those are wisdom, temperance, justice, fortitude, and then the 3 higher theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And as the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 13, the greatest of these is love. So Ripa's text below there in Italian explains that there are 3 children because of charity's triple power, that without her, faith and hope are nothing. So she's the most essential virtue. Incidentally, if you look at her head, you'll also see that there are flames emanating from the top of her head, which means that to show that she's always active and never idle, which I think many moms can also relate to. So print artists were interested in this idea of the 7 virtues and in creating print series that would show them all. So if we take a look at the next slide, we will take a look at one of the first series here. We'll look at 2 tonight. The first series that we're looking at here is designed by the Italian Renaissance artist Raphael and engraved by Marcantonio Raimondi. I'm showing you 4 of the 7 from the series. I think now we can easily recognize that Charity there is on the left with her 2 children. The other ones are Fortitude, which is strength, faith, and justice. In the next slide, we'll take a closer look at Charity. And so let's advance 1 and we'll look at this one in closer detail. Now, I really love this representation of Charity for a few reasons. One of which is that she is fiercely protective of her kids. The one in her arms is arching his back and twisting away from her, but she's got a very firm hand on his hip. And as we can see in that right detail, she is looking at him eye to eye with that gaze that we all know from our moms, like, enough is enough, young man, you just settle down, I'm in charge here. And then if we look at the one who is by her feet there, we see, in fact, she's not actually holding his hand, she's holding his wrist. And when you hold hands with a little kid and they can be squirmy, we know they can sort of like squirm their hand away, but if they're by the wrist, it's actually quite hard for them to wriggle away from you. So while it's a little bit anachronistic, what I imagine here is that there's this mom who is about to cross the street into traffic, and she is making sure that her kids do not get in harm's way. The other reason that I love this image is because I find this mom incredibly powerful and beautiful. I'm a little bit envious of her sculpted shoulders and biceps, and you see her strong striding leg moving forward, and her beautifully coiffed hair with that kind of headband that reminds me of the Wonder Woman tiara sort of headband with the, the triangle at the top. So I actually overall think she is kind of a whole package Wonder Woman style mom there with, she looks amazing and she's not letting anything happen to those kids of hers. Let's look at the next slide for a slightly different version of Charity. Now this one, some moms, including myself, may identify a little more with this image. We have an image of Charity who's a little rounder, a little less sculpted perhaps, a little bit more maybe down to earth, though she does still have wings, so she still has some superpowers there. What I think is interesting is we see her children have a slightly different relationship to her. They're a little bit more tender. They're turning in towards her. Even the dog is looking up at her adoringly. We also see that this is from a print series. We see the number 3 there at kind of the upper right of the image and the word Charitas. This is a tiny little German series. And if we actually, well, hold on one sec. What I want to say here is this is also part of a series. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about the comparison between, again, perhaps stereotypical, but these very well behaved little German children compared to the fierce and spirited Italian ones in their previous version. One of the great things I would say about getting to do these Zoom chats with you all is sharing so many works from our collection. But one thing that we kind of lose is a sense of scale of these works. And so in the next slide, I want to show you the relative size of the 2 prints that I just showed you, the 2 engravings. So the Raimondi Italian version is about 8 inches tall. But then if we look at the other one, you can see it's really like a postage stamp size one. So it's less than 1 inch wide and just over 1 inch tall there. So it's this lovely little miniature work. And so I'm hoping that once our museum's back open, that I can welcome you back to the print study room and show you these beautiful miniature works in person. And you can see the different styles of our moms there in size and shape. Just to wrap up my portion, we're going to circle back and take a look again one more time at our first painting. And what we know now is that Charity is usually represented with 2 or 3 children, and so it's unusual to see her here with 5. And I think what the artist is doing is moving Charity from being allegorical to including a practical element as well. Because of the model of the mother's selfless love, one child has learned to comfort another one who's crying there in the corner. The mother's love is instructive and then becomes manifest in charitable deeds that reverberate through the generations. And I just think this is a beautiful commentary on the power of a mother's love to change the world. Thanks.
We are truly changing the world every day at a time. I think it's interesting, and I'm very thankful for your way of introducing the maternal now in our conversation, because it's about the act of giving, you know. And I think that's why it's so important to acknowledge that motherhood is not only the person who gives birth, no, but also the many ways in which people can give, and which is something especially needed these days, right?
Yes, yeah. No, I think so. I think that's what the larger idea of giving sacrificially of yourself to anyone is that act of charity and love, and then charitable acts that happen out in the world. I am seeing a question here about how these tiny images were used, which I think is a great question. Because we talked about how I mentioned how they're sort of postage stamp size. I think these were, well, what we do know is that collectors would love to collect the whole series, and then they would paste them into little albums and enjoy them. As you imagine anybody who was maybe a stamp collector today would be flipping through an album, looking at it, enjoying the sort of the preciousness of this tiny little image, using a magnifying glass perhaps to notice even more little details. The way that artists, or the way that collectors use them in the past, would be to collect them in albums. And it was good marketing for the printmakers if they did a whole series, because then you would want all of them. And if they were numbered, you didn't want to not have number 7 or something. So it was part of a business strategy as well.
Thanks, Holly, so much. So Holly's been talking about maternal symbolism in art, and now Rosario is going to give us a little bit of a historical account of motherhood in the New World.
And I'm going to start with an image that I think it's fantastic. Behold the mother of the Inca Empire, people. This lady, Mama Huaco, is, as was saying, it was believed to be the mother of all Incas. She was, legend has it, the both sister and wife of Manco Cápac. And if we can go to the next slide, because I'm going to present you Manco Cápac and Sinchiroca, who is her son. And this genealogy was very, very important because in Inca, in the mindset of the Inca, genealogy was important as a way to tell the story of who they were. And so what we're looking at is, this illustration comes from a book that is called the Sacred History of the History of the Inca. And it was authored by a Mercedarian friar named Martin de Murua. The document is as a manuscript folio size, so it's very, very small. And is now at the Getty Research Institute. And so Mama Huaco was very important as the starting point of this genealogy, but also because she was the head of all collas, all the subsequent queens that govern along the male kings or emperors. But also she was considered a very, very important figure in history because she was believed to have shown men and women the sacred place where corn was first grown. So it was very important for that reason, but more so because she was believed to have taught women the most important art of weaving. And this is something crucial for all understanding the culture in the Andes, you know, both pre-conquest and after the conquest. And now we're going to see our next slide. And we're going to see how in another illustrated manuscript, there's only 3 illustrated manuscripts in the Andes in the colonial period. And we have seen one of them, and we're seeing the second one. You see a woman that is weaving, holding her kid on the back. She is using one of the most traditional tools for weaving in the Andes, and I would say also in Mexico and in other parts of the Americas. And what we're seeing here is a mother working, combining the both activities that she's forced to do, like we are all doing these days when we have the kids and we have to work with the kids around us. And it's interesting because this is a document that was made by a man, you see the name there, Huamampoma de Ayala, and he wrote this as a very extensive letter to the King of Spain, Philip III, where he wanted to tell the story of the Inca. He also included an image of Mama Huaco and of Manco Cápac, but he wanted also and mainly to talk about and denounce the bad ways of the colonizers. So this is almost, it was written almost a century after the arrival of the Spaniards in Peru, and he was complaining about the ways of the colonizers. And one way of doing it was through images, and we know that he was the author of these images, and we see here a Dominican friar being abusive to this woman, and that's why she's crying while working, because he's demanding, instead of providing some religious comfort, this man is asking her to weave kumbi, which is kumbi, which is the most delicate of all textiles, and she's had to comply with that. But one thing that I wanted to talk about is the obvious mestizo population that was the result of an exchange between mothers and fathers from different backgrounds. Most of them were, the father was of a Spanish descent, and the indigenous woman was or became the mother of these mestizos. And it's interesting to consider that, of course, it has been studied that many of these mestizos were the result of rape and violence, natural in a conquest environment. But a lot of them were not that violent, and they were really, these unions were also the result of loving relationships, sometimes between master and servant, sometimes between a soldier and the descendant of an Inca ruler. And that was the case of Huamampoma. His mother was an Inca ruler, or the daughter of an Inca ruler. And it's interesting because by marrying a man of a Spanish descent, or a Spanish man himself, they would be able to find some social mobility. And something that it's interesting is that we have documents, wills mainly, where mothers are always taking care of their sons and daughters through wills, and they're leaving behind, bequeathing to them money and land and precious textiles. And that's why we know how they were able to advance socially. Even in cases where the children, these mestizo children, were taken away from them, because it was preferred that they were raised by the Spanish side of the family. But I'm going to ask you to come with me to see this other image, because besides or beyond documents, even religious paintings like the one that we're looking at, we can, or they allow us to see, to think what motherhood was in colonial Peru. And what we're seeing here is the birth of the Virgin Mary. And one would think, well, okay, this is very established iconography, but all the elements that we see on there, especially on the front, that big pot of pottery, allow us to start thinking in how these practices took place. And I want to think about the role of midwives. That's a profession that was also learned mother to daughter. It was understood as something that you would pass along on your own family. It was kind of another kind of genealogy. And we'll see them here. Anne is on the bed, Joachim is also part of the scene. And I think it's striking in this painting that the Virgin Mary is presented in the nude, which might be not the most decorous thing. It's against decorum because it's the mother of Jesus. But I think it's interesting to think that this was a common practice when a little kid was just born, and it was he or she received a bath just after the birth. Something that is interesting in terms of history also is that at the end of the colonial period, around 1750 onwards, there was a whole debate about whether or not midwives were the best way of bringing children to the world. It was a moment where the Enlightenment was asking for more hygiene, and doctors started to write new articles in newspaper asking the upper class women to avoid using midwives. And I think it's interesting, because there's a whole debate also in terms of gender and how the arrival of doctors and hospitals allowed for men to control even more the body of women in labor. Another practice, and that was challenged during the last years of the colonial period regarding motherhood, was the use of wet nurses. And we're going to see the next painting. breastfeeding woman on the bottom right. And I think it's important because for upper class women, the use of wet nurses was very common, especially for Spanish women of Spanish descent that use either mestizo or indigenous or mulatto women. Mulatto, and again, with these ideas of the alignment, authors would say it's better if the mother is the one who actually start breastfeeding the baby instead of relying in a third party. And that became a practice very, very common in the 1770s around. And I think it's interesting how this breastfeeding woman that we're seeing in the corner is having a conversation with the woman next to her. Because if you agree with me, this person that is giving or is presenting her back to us is pointing to the main scene. The main scene is the presentation of the Virgin Mary into the temple. And we see how Anne, who is in the middle of the first arch, no, in the foreground, is letting the little kid go up, up the stairs to meet the priest that is accepting her into the community. Both this and the previous painting that we saw were made most likely for churches to indoctrinate into what the life of Mary was. But I also think that this particular painting, it's allow us to have another interpretation, thinking that the two women talking in the foreground are acknowledging how important it is to have a community to raise their kids. And I think it's also evident in how we are now as mothers. It really takes a village to raise one kid. And this painting is talking about that capacity of being together for such a fantastic yet tiring activity that is motherhood.
Thanks so much, Rosario, for that. That was so extremely interesting. And I'm glad you ended on that idea of it takes a village. And I would like to start there. Stacy, do you mind throwing up my next slide? Oh, where'd they go? Where are slides? It's okay. Let's check it. Well, since we're waiting for slides. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that.
Please jump in and ask Rosario. There's a lot of questions for Rosario too.
I'm going. Barry Torch is saying, in Martins de Murua's La Historia General, are these European illustrations or done by indigenous people? Do we know? That's a very good question. We know that Murua wrote like a draft of this Historia General, and those most likely were made by Wamampoma, the author of the second manuscript that I showed. The ones that I show you, it most likely that he was involved in the making of these. They're very more European looking, if you agree with me, but we don't know who the author is. And because since the Getty bought the manuscript, they have been doing a lot of studies, technical analysis on who the pigments and other things that were used. And there is not enough information to say who is the author. We know that they were made in Peru, and Murua took the manuscript back to Spain when he, just a couple of years before he died, with the hope that that manuscript could be published. But he got I think he got sick, and then he died in 1515, if I remember correctly. And so that's the story. And then, why is the priest holding her hair in which one? Florencia is asking. Stacy, can we go back? Anyways, so it's the painting was painted for a church. These horizontal paintings that tell the story of Mary, most of the times were made for the sides of the wall. So while you were walking in the nave, the main nave, you would be learning about the history of the oh, why in Guamampoma, why is the priest? I think it's because he's torturing her in a way. He's forcing her to work for him. And then someone is saying that there are incredible flowers on the steps. I think flowers are always a symbol of Mary, as part of the symbol of her purity and her beauty. And I think that's what I can say before we jump back to talking about community and what Chrissy has to share with us.
Thanks, Rosario. I am so excited to be here. We have a very important update. I want to let you know, not only is Holly's mom here, but my mom is on the phone. She is listening to us. So she could not figure out Zoom, but she made it. I'm really excited about that. I'm also excited to be able to talk to you guys tonight about 20th century art. So as you know, I'm a Renaissance specialist, but they're letting me talk about 20th century art, and I feel so honored to do it. So the first image I'm talking about on this theme of the extended maternal network that helps raise children and the village that it takes to raise a child is a drawing called I've Been Buked and I've Been Scorned by the African-American artist Charles White, who lived in the 20th century. He passed away in the late 70s. I love this drawing. I am a sucker for beautiful drawings, and this one is amazing. It's about 2 foot by 3 foot, so it's a big one. It really takes up space. When it's like painting sized, right? So when you go and see it, you're standing in front of it, and what we're looking at is an image of a woman standing in front of a doorway, and she's extending her hand to us. And the woman is very older. She looks like she's been through a lot, right? Like her body is very broad. Her breasts are heavy and sagging. The clothes that she's wearing look like they're made of rough, coarse, maybe cheaper material. She has wrinkles on her face. Her hair is not perfectly coiffed. She's not really concerned so much with what she looks like. But she looks very strong, and she's standing in front of this doorway with this very important vertical bar that is holding the door jamb up, right? The door itself. And that to me adds to this sense of strength. And that sense of strength, I think, is really important because Charles White is an African-American artist, grew up on the south side of Chicago, which excites me because I just moved from there to here. And he learned art on the south side of Chicago and then went on to become a very important teacher. But he was the child of a single mother, mostly, and he spent a lot of days in his childhood at the Chicago Public Library, where he went because his mom couldn't afford childcare, and so that's where she dropped him off. And I think that's an amazing, beautiful story about women's strength and just doing what you need to do. I think this is an extremely beautiful story. And I think also what is beautiful about it is that he speaks about the importance of the other women in his life. And this woman that is greeting us at the doorway is not a portrait of a particular woman, rather it's a composite of lots of women that were important in his life. So this feeling of being welcomed by a woman. Now, can we go to the next slide, please, Stacy? Thank you. I wanted to show you that Charles White really knew what he was doing. He had studied art. And so what we have here is a painting from the 1400s by a famous Italian artists, Masaccio and Mazzolino, and that's St. Anne with the Virgin Mary and Christ. And what I thought was really interesting is the way here that St. Anne is painted as this strong protective figure with her arm, her hand moving out, protecting the child, and her own child, and the Christ child is so important. Can we move forward one more, Stacy, please? Thank you. I wanted to bring to your attention the title, I've Been Buked and I've Been Scorned, is the name of a spiritual, an African-American spiritual, the type of song that would be sung that slaves and then later Black people in America would sing while they were working to pass the time. And it became the opening of Alvin Ailey's American Dance Theater's production of Revelation. So this very famous image is of Mahalia, it's not Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia Jackson, Queen of Gospel, sang this song right before Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. So this song speaks to the resiliency of the human spirit under oppression. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Can we move forward one more? I want to talk about a different work of art. And I am so excited to talk about this because this is a quilt in our collection called Blocks and Stripes. And this quilt is made by an artist, Mary Lee Bendolph. And why I think this is extremely special, textile arts have been so important to women since the dawn of time, right? We've been weaving and sewing in the household and passing these crafts on and traditions on and art forms on generation after generation after generation. So Mary Lee Bendolph is part of an artists collective, a quilting collective, Gee's Bend. It's a town in Southwest Alabama, very, very isolated and very remote since the time of the end of slavery. And the people living there have basically have stayed there and passed on the tradition of quilting over time. And they do some amazing things. So can you move forward, please, Stacy? I wanted to show you this detail right down there, this little piece right here. You have this corduroy quilt, and then this like extremely sweet detail that just of this hand stitching that I think is so beautiful. And what is so cool about this quilt in particular, so it's made of corduroy, in the 70s, the people who lived in this town were hired by the Sears Roebuck factory to make pillowcases by hand. So they've been quilting and making these master quilts forever, and then Sears moves in and hires them all. And what they start to do is to take home the fabric scraps, because quilting is a craft, an art made to use up materials. You see fabric on the street, you pick it up and it becomes a quilt. And the artists describe that. They describe finding fabric on the floor when they were little kids and bringing it home to their mothers, and then watching their mothers clean it and sew it, and sitting under them while they were sewing. And I found this very moving because I learned how to do textile arts like that. I remember sitting on my grandmother's porch as a child and on her couch learning how to crochet and cross stitch and sew with my grandmother and my aunts and my mom. And that was always really important to me. Can we move forward one more, please? Thank you. So this is very interesting. One of the things that the artists in the collective talk about is they would hang these quilts on their clotheslines and display them that way, and people would go and look at them, and then they'd go to the nearest town and go see other people's quilts. And they think it's fabulous that now when you hear them talk, they're just think it's an amazing, beautiful thing that their quilts have ended up in museums, and when they have been doing, hanging them on their clotheslines. I just think that's spectacular. We're looking at one of the families, one of the women, Mary Margaret Petway. The Petway family makes extremely beautiful quilts. And again, this tradition's been passed on from mother to child, or aunts and sisters and extended networks, generation after generation since the late 1800s. And the way they talk about learning this and as it being a prayerful, meditative activity or repeated action, and learning and talking about family and singing these same kind of spirituals that Charles White referenced in his I've been Buked, I've been Scorned. It's this extremely important communal practice. Can we move forward, please? And I wanted to bring to your attention, if you've been to the National Portrait Gallery, and it was touring, but unfortunately, nothing's open. But Amy Sherald, the presidential portrait of our First Lady, Michelle Obama, this amazing textile garment that she is wearing that is so stunning in real life. If you can see this portrait, please go and see this portrait. It's so beautiful. But the details in the foreground on her garment were inspired partially by Mondrian, but I think more importantly, and just as beautifully, is she was also inspired by the women of the artist collective of Gee's Bend when she made the First Lady's garment. And I just think these are absolutely stunning. And you see a whole variety of them on the left. So this practice of textile arts and communal work, I think, is so important to the idea of mothering and what mothering is. And just, I want to end, one more slide, please, Stacy. I want to give a shout out to all my fur mommies and daddies out there who take good care of their fur babies. I myself have a little dog who's too big now, but once upon a time she was a little baby. Can we see her? Ah! There she was. She was so little with her little puppy belly. That's Ella. So I'm not a mom, but I hope I've done a good job, and I hope I've bragged sufficiently about my little puppy baby. And if you have any questions, I'm sure we'd love to take them.
Chrissy, it looks like you have a question about the dress that Michelle Obama is wearing. Do we know if it's a real dress or was it made up by the artist?
That's a really, really great question. And so I actually spent too much time trying to figure out the answer to that. And so my feeling is that it's probably a dress inspired by the kinds of patterns that the Petway family in particular might be making. But generally, I was unable to find an exact match. I think it's the kinds of patterns. And those patterns, again, are really determined by the materials and the fabrics that you're using. So for example, when we looked at the Mary Lee Bendolph quilt, the blocks and stripes, those are square vertical configurations, and that's because corduroy, and I think you'll understand if you think about corduroy, if you cut corduroy diagonally, it's gonna fray and start to fall apart. So corduroy is a material that needs to be cut at perpendicular angles, and as a result, it influences the kinds of patterns you're able to make. So I think that that's also really interesting, that the materials in the case of quilting really determine what the end product is going to look like.
Great. Well, I see a question that we have for Rosario about the midwife in your painting, Rosario, I think from the Birth of Mary. It says that there's a definite triangle on the bodice. Does this symbolize her relationship to Mary and birth?
Can we, Stacy, can we go to the image so we can see it? I think it is the cloth on the foreground, I think it's related to what midwives were used to do, and they continue to do, and this renewal of midwifery in, I don't know, maybe the last 50 years or so. They are, I assume that that's what the painting is depicting. But also I love the combination of colors and how that strong white as well is a reference to the character of Mary, as a holy being. I think all tiny babies that small, when they're just out of your womb, you feel that they're the most incredible creatures. I remember when my son was born, after, I don't know, a couple of hours, more than a couple of labor, he was so ugly. But I saw him as the most incredibly beautiful being. And when I saw the pictures, I said, no, he was definitely not as gorgeous as I saw him. But anyways, so I guess this painting, going back to the painting, it's related to that, to how make a significant comment about the divinity of Mary, because, there's a whole debate among Catholics, if whether or not Mary is divine herself or not. And I guess the white cloth is just a reference to that, to that character. And I see another question but I don't know if it's, oh, the gentleman in the back is Joachim, who is the father of Mary, the husband of Anne, that we have seen a couple of times depicted tonight.
Holly, we have a question about Charity. Do you think that Charity could represent a wet nurse?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Rosario touched on the question of wet nurses, and I think at that time period, in the sort of early 17th century, wet nurses were not a high-class profession, right? The upper classes used wet nurses and sent their children out to wet nurses. So to have a painting sort of glorifying the profession of a wet nurse, I think would be unusual. I think it's at that time period, artists are looking for sort of these larger allegorical, inspirational topics, thematic topics of sort of love and charity. But it's interesting when you start looking, a little bit later on when there are more genre scenes and artists start painting sort of more real life scenes, you do start to see wet nurses when you start to see images of kind of peasant life and more day-to-day life. So that's, this artist, Jacques Blanchard, tends to do more of these kind of what are considered sort of higher genre topics. And I will say there are actually he did several versions of Charity. There's one at the Toledo Art Museum, which is also beautiful, and the Louvre, and I think also in a private collection in France, there's a few other versions of this Charity one. So seemed to be he was there's a lot of demand for his images of charity, but it's interesting to think about the different class relationships too at play and who would be a wet nurse and whether you would be painting a wet nurse at this period or not.
Yeah, Rosario was talking the other day about the idea that a wet nurse, an indigenous wet nurse, might cause the child to come out a certain way, which I found to be really interesting because there are all these stories Michelangelo claiming that the reason that he was such a great sculptor was because his wet nurse was the wife of a stonecutter. So I think there's it's very interesting that the idea that like personality traits could be passed through breast milk. Yeah.
And it's interesting because there was a lot of, all this idea that if you eat certain things when you're pregnant, your kid is going to have certain, features even, or if you are craving for ice cream and then you fail to eat the ice cream, and then so your son or daughter are going to have something wrong with them because you didn't know. All these ideas were very challenged during the alignment. And I think it's interesting because in Lima and in Mexico, and I guess in Europe the same, all these debates happened in newspapers. And so everybody were talking about what was the effect of being a good mother, and it was, common talk. And how science and centuries old practices were being challenged by this new thing called science, which seems interesting conversation.
Rosario, we don't have a ton of time left at all, but we do have one person asking us, is there a place to see modern quilts in Austin? That's a really great question. I hope that when the Blantons open, you'll come and see ours when it's on view because it's beautiful. And also, there's an Austin quilt collective. There's a quilting guild. I learned all of this as I was doing research. I don't know where to go and see them on a day-to-day basis, but if you find out, please tell me because I want to go and look at them. These women are amazing. Their story is beautiful and inspiring, and it's made me want to quilt, honestly. So, maybe next week maybe next week I'll show you my blocks.
We're looking forward for that definitely, Chrissy. I think that's it for tonight's conversation. Thank you all to all of you for joining us. And it was really a pleasure to share some of our thoughts about this very complex topic of what is motherhood and what makes us mothers. And before you leave, here are a few reminders. Our next curated conversation will be next Tuesday, May 19th at 5 p.m. And the topic is Flower Power, Art and Baking at the Blanton, featuring a live Q&A with Ginevra Higginson and Carlota Stankiewicz, and our returning guest, Chrissy Zappella, enlightening us all as she did just now. And please, to watch past curated conversations, take virtual art tours, and explore other Museum from Home content, go to blanton.org/museum from home. And if you like to show your support, you can become a member at blantonmuseum.org/membership. If you just want info about upcoming programs and other news, please sign up for our newsletter at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe. And finally, if you have topics you would love to see us cover in the future curated conversations, please drop us a line at media@blantonmuseum.org. Thanks again, and we'll see you next Tuesday.